Sarah Morgan stepped out of the taxi, her heels clicking against the pavement as she dragged her suitcase behind her. The sky above Willow Creek was painted a dull gray, heavy with the promise of rain. Her heart raced with anticipation as she approached the large gates of the mansion she called home for the past 12 years. The wrought iron gates stood tall and imposing, but there was something different about them today, something unsettling. Her eyes narrowed as she noticed her belongings, familiar and unmistakable, scattered across the driveway. Suitcases, boxes, even her favorite reading chair were carelessly tossed out like discarded remnants of a life that no longer mattered. Confusion clawed at her mind as she quickened her steps, her heels sinking slightly into the gravel. She scanned the chaos, her fingers brushing over familiar fabrics and treasured belongings. The photo frames were cracked, the glass shattered, the faces of happier times smeared with dirt. She paused, holding a framed wedding photo, her eyes bright with love, James's arm wrapped tightly around her waist. That day had been filled with promises, whispers of forever, and dreams built on shared hopes. Now it lay fractured in her hands, a mere echo of what once was. Her hand trembled as she set the frame down gently, unwilling to break it any further. Her mind reeled with questions. What was happening? Why were her things outside? Was there a mistake? She straightened her back and walked with purpose towards the front door, her fists clenched at her sides. As Sarah reached the door, it swung open before she could knock. Standing there with a smug smile plastered across her face was Melissa. She was dressed impeccably in a silk robe that fluttered around her slender frame, her hair perfectly curled, and her lips painted a shade too bold for midday. Sarah's eyes widened, disbelief etched into every line of her face. "What are you doing here?" Sarah demanded, her voice a mixture of shock and restrained fury. Melissa leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed over her chest, examining her nails with disinterest. "Oh, you didn't know?" she replied, her voice dripping with condescension. "James moved me in. He said you wouldn't be coming back. I guess you didn't get the memo." The words sliced through Sarah like shards of glass, leaving her breathless. She blinked, her mind struggling to catch up with the reality unfolding before her. "That's impossible," Sarah whispered, shaking her head. "This is my house, my home. You have no right." Melissa chuckled, the sound hollow and mocking. "Your house?" she scoffed, gesturing around her as if inspecting the property for the first time. "Not anymore. James made it clear that I'm the woman of the house now. He even had your things packed up. Thought it was generous of him to leave them outside for you to collect." Sarah's fists clenched, her knuckles turning white. She stepped forward, refusing to be intimidated by Melissa's arrogance. "Where is he?" she demanded, her voice firm and unyielding. "Where's James?" Melissa's smile widened, her eyes glimmering with delight. "Out," she said simply, stepping back to close the door. "And I suggest you take your junk and leave before I call the police." With that, the door slammed shut, leaving Sarah standing in the rain-soaked driveway, her world crumbling around her. The rain began to fall, slow and steady at first, then building into a relentless downpour. It drenched her hair, plastering it to her face, but she did not move. Her eyes remained fixed on the closed door, her mind spinning with disbelief and mounting rage. How could James do this? How could he throw away 12 years of marriage, of loyalty and sacrifice, for someone like Melissa? She replayed the moments in her mind, the late nights at the office, the secretive phone calls, the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered the room. She had brushed them off as paranoia, convincing herself that her husband would never betray her. But now, standing in the rain, surrounded by the scattered fragments of her life, she realized the truth had been staring her in the face all along. She swallowed back the sob that threatened to escape her throat, forcing herself to breathe. Her hands shook as she picked up the pieces of her life, one by one, stacking them neatly despite the pouring rain. Neighbors peered from behind their curtains, their shadows flickering as they whispered amongst themselves. She ignored them, her focus on gathering what was hers, refusing to let Melissa's triumph become her shame. Her body ached with each movement, but she refused to break. Not here. Not like this. Her fingers were numb from the cold and the weight of what she carried, but she continued until the last of her belongings were packed. She stood for a moment, staring at the house she had built with James, every brick a testament to their shared dreams. Her chest tightened with the sting of betrayal, but she straightened her shoulders, refusing to let the grief consume her. The rain poured harder, blurring the edges of her vision as she lifted her chin and walked away, her steps slow but deliberate. She dragged her suitcases to the curb, her hands blistered and raw, but her spirit unyielding. A car pulled up beside her, and the window rolled down to reveal Victoria's concerned face. Without a word, Victoria got out, her umbrella shielding them both as she embraced Sarah tightly. Sarah's resolve cracked just for a moment, and she let herself feel the pain. But only for a moment. She pulled back, wiping her eyes and nodding firmly. "I'm not done," she whispered, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Victoria's eyes sparkled with understanding and determination. "Good," she replied, "because neither am I." Together, they loaded Sarah's belongings into the car, the rain pounding against the roof like the drumbeat of war. As they pulled away from the mansion, Sarah looked back one last time, her jaw clenched and her eyes burning with resolve. Melissa may have thrown her out, but she was far from defeated. In fact, she was just getting started. The rain had stopped by the time Sarah settled into Victoria's cozy apartment, the warmth of the space a stark contrast to the cold she had just endured. Boxes were stacked neatly in the corner, her belongings still damp from the downpour, but she couldn't bring herself to unpack. Her hands rested around a steaming cup of tea, its heat seeping into her chilled fingers. Victoria moved around the kitchen with practiced ease, clinking dishes and setting out food neither of them had the appetite to eat. Silence hung between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Sarah's gaze remained fixed on the window, watching raindrops chase each other down the glass. Her mind was a chaotic storm of memories and questions. How had she not seen this coming? How long had Melissa been part of her life, lurking in the shadows, stealing pieces of her marriage bit by bit? She clenched her jaw, her knuckles whitening against the ceramic of the mug. She remembered the late nights James had brushed off with casual excuses, the business trips that always seemed to extend longer than necessary, the whispers and side glances she had ignored, chalking it up to paranoia or the pressure of work. But it was all there, laid out in fragments she had refused to piece together. Victoria set a plate of food in front of her, the aroma breaking through her thoughts. "You need to eat," Victoria said softly, her eyes filled with concern. Sarah managed a nod, picking up the fork, though the food tasted like ash in her mouth. Her appetite had vanished, replaced with a gnawing ache that settled in her chest. She forced herself to chew, her mind far away from the present moment, tangled up in the past she could no longer change. Victoria sat across from her, her gaze unwavering. "You need to fight back," she said firmly, breaking the silence. Sarah looked up, her eyes meeting Victoria's steady stare. "Fight back," she repeated, her voice a mere whisper. Victoria leaned forward, her hands clasped together as if holding the very idea between her palms. "Yes, James and Melissa can't just throw you out of your own home and expect you to vanish quietly," she continued, her voice laced with conviction. Sarah hesitated, the notion foreign and strange. She had always been the peacemaker, the one to smooth things over, to forgive and forget for the sake of harmony. But there was no harmony now, only chaos and betrayal. The image of Melissa standing in her doorway, smug and victorious, flashed in her mind, reigniting the fury that had simmered beneath her grief. "I don't even know where to start," Sarah admitted, her voice cracking slightly. Victoria's eyes sparkled with determination. "We start with the truth," she replied. "James may have done everything he could to erase you from that house, but he can't erase the law. That mansion, the cars, the accounts, you have every right to fight for what is yours." Sarah's hands tightened around the mug, her knuckles pale against the ceramic. "But what if? What if it's too late?" she whispered, her voice laced with doubt. Victoria's expression hardened, her gaze never wavering. "It's only too late if you let it be," she said firmly. "The longer you wait, the more they take. You need to stand up for yourself, Sarah. If you don't, they'll walk all over you." Sarah blinked back tears, her resolve strengthening with every word. For too long, she had stood in the shadows, silencing her own needs for the sake of others. But this was different. This was her life, her home, her legacy. And she was not ready to watch it be stolen right from under her. The next morning, Sarah woke up with a sense of clarity she had not felt in months. The sun streamed through Victoria's sheer curtains, casting a warm glow over the room. She stretched her limbs, the tension in her muscles slowly unraveling as she sat up. Today was the day she would begin the fight. No more tears, no more helplessness. Her fingers fumbled for her phone, and she dialed a number she had stored but never thought she would use, her lawyer, Mr. Grant. His voice was brisk and professional, but softened when she explained the situation. "I need to know what my rights are," she said firmly, her voice steady and unyielding. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a reassuring response. "Mrs. Morgan, you are legally entitled to everything that is rightfully yours. If the house is in your name, they have no right to throw you out. If you have ownership of the accounts, they cannot be accessed without your consent. We will gather everything and file a claim," he explained. Sarah listened intently, each word building a foundation of hope beneath her feet. "I want everything, Mr. Grant," she added, her voice hardening. "Everything that belongs to me. I won't let them get away with this." Mr. Grant's approval was evident in his tone. "That's the spirit, Mrs. Morgan. Let's get started right away. I'll need every document, every bit of evidence you have. Leave nothing out." Sarah nodded, determination coursing through her veins. She hung up the phone and looked around the room, her gaze landing on the boxes piled neatly in the corner. She had kept everything, receipts, deeds, contracts, all of it. James had always teased her for being a pack rat, but now it was about to become her greatest weapon. With Victoria's help, Sarah spent the next several hours sorting through the piles of papers she had kept over the years. It was a painstaking process, sifting through old mortgage agreements, bank statements, and insurance policies. But with each document unearthed, Sarah felt her confidence grow. Victoria worked alongside her, offering support and encouragement, never once faltering in her belief that Sarah would come out on top. By the time they finished, the living room floor was covered in neatly organized stacks of evidence. Titles of ownership bearing Sarah's name, investment portfolios she had built with her own money, even the very deed to the mansion that Melissa now flaunted as her own. It was all there, proof of Sarah's hard work and sacrifice, a legacy that James had tried to rip away. Sarah sat back on her heels, wiping the sweat from her brow, her heart pounding with satisfaction. "They won't know what hit them," Victoria said, her voice triumphant. Sarah looked up, her eyes alight with newfound strength. "No," she replied firmly, "they won't." It was the first time in weeks that Sarah had felt like herself again, the first time she had seen a glimmer of hope amidst the ruins of her marriage. She would fight. She would reclaim what was hers. And she would do it with the strength she had always possessed, buried beneath years of compromise and silence. Sarah took a deep breath, her gaze steely and unyielding. This was only the beginning, and she was ready for whatever came next. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as people filled the seats, their whispers like a low hum of anticipation. Sarah sat at the plaintiff's table, her back straight, eyes forward, and hands folded neatly in her lap. Her lawyer, Mr. Grant, shuffled through the stacks of documents they had painstakingly organized, occasionally whispering words of reassurance. She nodded, though her gaze never wavered from the heavy oak doors that led into the room. She was waiting, her heart steady but firm, knowing that James and Melissa would walk through those doors any minute now. The walls of the courtroom were tall and imposing, adorned with portraits of solemn-faced judges whose eyes seemed to follow every movement. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, casting long shadows that stretched across the polished floor. Sarah barely noticed. Her focus was singular. This was her moment. She could feel the weight of the past few weeks settle on her shoulders. But she refused to let it bend her. She was here to reclaim what was hers, and nothing would shake her resolve. The doors swung open, and a hush fell over the room. James walked in first, his shoulders stiff, eyes straight ahead. Melissa followed close behind, her expression haughty, lips painted in defiance. She strutted to her seat, ignoring the eyes that followed her. basking in the attention as though it were her birthright. Sarah watched them take their places, her expression unchanging, but a flicker of determination sparked in her eyes. This was it. This was where everything would be laid bare. She had nothing to hide, but she knew they did. The judge entered moments later, the courtroom rising in unison before sitting back down. His robes swept behind him as he took his seat, adjusting his glasses and clearing his throat. "We are here today to address the case of Morgan versus Morgan," he began, his voice deep and steady. "Mrs. Sarah Morgan claims ownership of the marital home and associated assets, citing illegal occupation and trespass by the defendants, Mr. James Morgan and Ms. Melissa Harrow." His gaze swept across the room, pausing briefly on Sarah before landing on James and Melissa. "Are both parties present?" the judge asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. James stood, his hands clasped in front of him. "We are, Your Honor," he replied, his voice steady but lacking its usual confidence. Melissa remained seated, her arms crossed defiantly, eyes fixed forward as if this entire proceeding was beneath her. Sarah's gaze remained steady, unflinching as she looked straight ahead. Her hands were folded in her lap, her spine straight and unyielding. Mr. Grant stood beside her, his briefcase open and files neatly stacked, ready to be presented at the right moment. The judge nodded, scribbling something on his notepad before turning his attention to Sarah. "Mrs. Morgan," he began, "I understand you have evidence supporting your claim of ownership to the property and assets in question?" Sarah took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the edges of the folder in front of her. "I do, Your Honor," she replied firmly, her voice steady and clear. "All of it is in my name, the house, the cars, the investments, everything." She could feel Melissa's gaze burn into the side of her face, but she refused to look in her direction. This was her moment, and she would not let anything distract her from it. Mr. Grant stepped forward, handing the judge a thick stack of documents bound neatly in a folder. "These are the deeds to the property, investment portfolios, and account statements, all in Mrs. Morgan's name," he announced, his voice carrying through the silent courtroom. The judge flipped through the pages, his expression unreadable as he scanned each document carefully. The silence stretched, the weight of anticipation growing heavier with each passing second. Sarah's heart thudded steadily in her chest, her eyes locked on the judge's hands as they moved from page to page. She caught a glimpse of Melissa out of the corner of her eye. Her lips were pursed, her eyes narrowing with every turn of the page. James sat rigidly beside her, his fingers clasped tightly together, the knuckles white. Finally, the judge set the documents down, adjusting his glasses once more. "It appears," he began slowly, his gaze shifting to James and Melissa, "that the property and all associated assets do indeed belong to Mrs. Morgan." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, hushed whispers bouncing off the walls as realization dawned on those watching. Sarah remained still, her expression calm, though her heart pounded with victory. Melissa's mouth dropped open, her eyes darting toward James, whose face had drained of color. "That can't be right," Melissa whispered, loud enough for the people around her to hear. "She doesn't own everything. She can't." Her voice trembled with disbelief, but the judge merely raised an eyebrow. "The documentation is clear," he said, tapping the folder in front of him. "Mrs. Morgan is the sole owner of the property and assets in question." Melissa's disbelief quickly morphed into outrage, her eyes flashing with fury as she turned to James. "You told me it was yours," she hissed, her voice barely contained. James's face remained pale, his hands shaking slightly as he glanced around the room. I thought it was," he stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of realization. The judge rapped his gavel once, silencing the whispers that had begun to build. "Order in the court," he demanded, his voice cutting through the tension. He turned his attention back to Sarah, his gaze softening slightly. "Mrs. Morgan," he began, "I am ruling in your favor. The defendants are ordered to vacate the premises immediately, and any accounts associated with the property are to be returned to your sole ownership. You are entitled to full restitution for any damages incurred during their occupation." Sarah felt the air rush from her lungs, the weight that had pressed against her chest for weeks finally lifting. She nodded, her voice steady as she replied, "Thank you, Your Honor." The gavel came down once more, the echo of it reverberating through the room, signaling the end of the trial. Melissa stood, her expression venomous as she stormed out of the courtroom, her heels clicking angrily against the floor. James followed, his shoulders slumped, his gaze fixed on the floor. Sarah remained seated for a moment, her hands trembling slightly as she let the reality of it all wash over her. She had won. Everything was hers. Slowly she stood, gathering her things with grace and dignity, nodding to Mr. Grant, who smiled approvingly. As she walked out of the courtroom, the whispers of admiration and disbelief followed her, but she held her head high, unyielding, and victorious. It was only the beginning. The sun hung low in the sky as Sarah stepped out of the car and gazed up at the mansion that had once been her sanctuary. It looked the same as it always had, its grand pillars standing tall and proud, the manicured lawns stretching out in perfect symmetry. But there was something different in the way she saw it now, a sense of victory pulsing through her veins as she walked up the driveway. Victoria was by her side, her hand resting gently on Sarah's arm as if anchoring her to the moment. The two women moved with purpose, heels clicking against the pavement in perfect rhythm. A police car idled at the curb, its lights flashing in silent warning. Two officers stood at the entrance, their expressions stoic as they waited for her approach. Sarah straightened her shoulders, lifting her chin as she met their gaze. "Mrs. Morgan?" one of the officers asked, his voice polite but firm. Sarah nodded, her grip on the folder she held tightening. "That's me," she replied, her tone unwavering. He stepped aside, gesturing toward the door. "You're clear to proceed. They've been notified." Sarah inhaled deeply, steeling herself for what lay ahead. This was her home, her life, and she was taking it back. The door creaked as she pushed it open, the familiar scent of polished wood and lavender drifting through the air. For a brief moment, nostalgia washed over her, memories of holidays and celebrations flickering behind her eyes. But she blinked them away, replacing sentiment with resolve. Melissa stood in the center of the living room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her lips pressed into a thin line. Her gaze was sharp, her posture rigid as she glared at Sarah with barely contained fury. James hovered behind her, his expression a tangled mess of shame and desperation. His shoulders were slumped, eyes cast downward, unwilling, or perhaps unable, to meet Sarah's stare. The officers stepped in behind Sarah, their presence a silent reminder of the law that now stood firmly on her side. "You have 15 minutes to collect your things," one of them announced, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. Melissa's eyes flared, her mouth opening to protest, but she seemed to think better of it. Instead, she turned on her heel, her movements jerky and ungraceful as she stomped up the stairs. James hesitated, his gaze flickering between Sarah and the officers before he finally followed, his footsteps heavy and slow. Sarah remained where she was, her hands clasped in front of her, her posture unyielding. This was not a victory born of malice or revenge. It was justice, pure and unblemished, and she would savor every second of it. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last as she stood in the foyer, waiting. She could hear muffled voices from upstairs, drawers slamming shut, the hurried shuffle of footsteps. She imagined Melissa throwing things into bags haphazardly, her perfect composure cracking under the weight of consequence. James, she knew, would be quieter, more deliberate, his movements heavy with regret. But she didn't allow herself to feel pity. Not anymore. They had made their choices, and now they were living with the consequences. Victoria stood beside her, silent but solid, her presence a pillar of support. Sarah glanced at her friend, offering a small, appreciative smile. "I never thought I'd see this day," she murmured, her voice soft but resolute. Victoria squeezed her arm gently. "You deserve this," she replied. "You fought for it. You earned it." Sarah nodded, the weight of the truth settling in her bones. This house had been hers from the start, built on her sacrifices and her dreams. James and Melissa had tried to take it, to strip her of everything she had worked for, but they had failed. And now, as the footsteps grew louder, signaling their descent down the stairs, she felt a surge of strength she hadn't known she possessed. Melissa came down first, her arms laden with hastily packed bags, her expression pinched and venomous. She spared Sarah one last glare, her lips curled in disgust, but Sarah didn't flinch. She met Melissa's gaze head-on, unyielding and unafraid. There was no need for words. The silence spoke volumes. Melissa shoved past the officers, her heels clacking angrily against the marble floor as she stormed out of the house, the door swinging shut behind her with a resounding thud. James followed moments later, his steps slower, more deliberate. He paused in the doorway, turning back to face Sarah. His eyes were glassy, rimmed with the weight of choices made in haste and regret. "Sarah," he began, his voice cracking slightly. She raised her hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Don't," she replied firmly, her tone resolute. "You made your choice, James. Now live with it." He opened his mouth to speak again, but she shook her head, the finality of the gesture silencing him. He lingered for a moment longer, his eyes searching hers for something, remorse, forgiveness, maybe even understanding. But he found none. Sarah's gaze remained steady, her heart unyielding. Finally, he nodded, the movement slow and resigned, and turned to follow Melissa out the door. The officers exchanged glances before stepping outside, leaving Sarah and Victoria alone in the grand hallway. Sarah exhaled slowly, the tension slipping from her shoulders as the house settled into silence. She looked around, taking in the space that was now fully hers once again. A sense of peace washed over her, mingling with the satisfaction of justice served. This was her home, her legacy, and no one would ever take it from her again. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of restoration and renewal for Sarah. She threw herself into reclaiming her space, erasing every trace of Melissa's presence from the mansion. The walls were repainted, the furniture rearranged, and every single item that had been touched by betrayal was purged without hesitation. It was more than just a renovation. It was an act of reclamation. Her mornings began early, with sunlight pouring through the freshly cleaned windows, illuminating the polished wood floors that once felt so heavy with sadness. She walked through the halls with newfound purpose, her footsteps confident and assured. There was no more hesitation, no more uncertainty about her place in the world. This was hers. Every brick, every tile, every corner of the estate spoke of her labor, her sacrifices, and now her victory. Contractors came and went, restoring what had been neglected and mending what had been broken. Victoria was by her side through it all, her spirit as unwavering as her friendship. Together, they picked out new drapes, redesigned the living room, and reimagined the garden that had been left untended for far too long. It was as though every piece of furniture, every brush stroke of paint was a testament to Sarah's strength, a visible marker of her resurgence. The mansion began to look like it once did, but better, more alive, more hers. Neighbors whispered as they passed, admiring the transformation, nodding in approval at the woman who had reclaimed what was rightfully hers. As the mansion took shape, so too did Sarah's life. She began to reach out to women in Willow Creek who had been through their own battles, those who had been silenced, cast aside, or forgotten. Her victory had sparked something within her, a flame that grew brighter with each story she heard. Victoria encouraged her, suggesting that they form a group, a safe haven where women could share their experiences and rebuild their lives. The idea blossomed quickly, and soon enough, the first meeting was held in Sarah's newly furnished living room. Women of all ages gathered, their faces etched with lines of pain and resilience, their voices soft but resolute. They shared their stories of betrayal, of loss, of strength, and Sarah listened with an open heart. She spoke too, her voice steady as she recounted her own journey. There was no bitterness in her words, only resolve and solidarity. The group grew, spreading through Willow Creek and beyond, drawing in women from neighboring towns who had heard of Sarah's triumph. She became a symbol of reclamation and hope, her story inspiring others to fight for what was theirs, to reclaim what had been unjustly taken. Sarah found purpose in their gatherings, strength in their unity. The mansion that had once felt like a tomb of betrayal now stood as a beacon of resilience and renewal, its walls echoing with laughter and solidarity instead of whispers of deceit. The community took notice of Sarah's transformation, not just of her home, but of her spirit. Her name became synonymous with strength, her presence a symbol of triumph over betrayal. She was approached to speak at local events, invited to share her story with women's groups, and even asked to help advocate for women going through similar struggles. Sarah embraced the opportunities with open arms, her confidence growing with each story she heard, each hand she shook. It was as if reclaiming her home had awakened something within her, a purpose that had been buried beneath years of compromise and silence. Victoria stood by her side through it all, her support unwavering, her pride evident in every smile she cast Sarah's way. They expanded their meetings, renting out larger venues to accommodate the growing number of women who came to hear Sarah speak, to share their own stories, and to find solace in the company of those who understood. Her living room became a hub of support and encouragement, a place where silence was broken and voices were heard. It was during one of these gatherings that Sarah announced the opening of a community center for women, an idea she and Victoria had been quietly working on for months. The room erupted in applause, tears of joy spilling down cheeks as women embraced one another, their spirits lifted by the promise of hope and renewal. Sarah's eyes glimmered with pride as she looked around the room, the faces of women who had found strength in her story reflecting back at her. This was what she had fought for, not just for herself, but for all of them. James's fall from grace was swift and brutal. With Melissa gone and his finances drained from the legal battle, he found himself isolated and struggling. The whispers that followed him wherever he went were laced with pity and scorn, his reputation tarnished beyond repair. Those who had once sung his praises now avoided him, unwilling to associate with the man who had lost everything. Sarah heard of his downfall through whispers and murmurs, but she did not seek out the details. She had moved on, her life filled with purpose and joy that far outweighed the bitterness of the past. She no longer carried the weight of betrayal, no longer looked over her shoulder for shadows of what once was. Her focus was entirely on the present, on rebuilding, on empowering, on thriving. But James did not disappear entirely. Every so often, she would hear his name in passing, another failed business venture, another desperate plea for assistance. There were rumors that he had tried to reach out to Melissa, but she had moved on quickly, attaching herself to another wealthy man in the next town over. Sarah did not linger on the thought. Her heart was too full of purpose to waste time on what was lost. Her mansion had become more than just a symbol of victory. It was a place of healing, of growth, of unyielding strength. And that was all she needed. The past was gone, swept away like dust in the wind, and in its place stood a woman who had reclaimed not only her home but her life. The evening sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the driveway as Sarah stepped out onto the porch. The air was crisp and clean, scented faintly with the blooming flowers that lined the garden she had painstakingly restored. It was her ritual now to walk the grounds at sunset, breathing in the tranquility of her reclaimed life. The mansion stood proud and unyielding behind her, its windows gleaming with fresh polish, its walls echoing with the laughter and conversations of new beginnings. The house no longer felt haunted by betrayal or shadowed by loss. It was hers entirely and completely, and every inch of it now whispered of strength and renewal. She paused at the edge of the garden, her eyes scanning the vibrant petals and the lush greenery that swayed gently in the breeze. It had taken weeks of work, of digging and planting, of pulling weeds and pruning bushes, but the effort had been worth it. Her hands, once softened by comfort, were now calloused with determination, a physical testament to the fight she had waged and won. She reached out, brushing her fingers against the petals of a rose, its fragrance sweet and familiar. It was the same breed she had planted with James years ago, back when dreams were shared and futures were planned. For a moment, nostalgia crept into her heart, but she brushed it away with the same resilience that had carried her through the storm. That life was gone, but what stood in its place was stronger, more unyielding, and entirely hers. As Sarah moved back toward the house, she noticed headlights approaching the driveway, their beams cutting through the growing dusk. Her steps slowed, a flicker of curiosity sparking in her chest. Few visitors came unannounced these days, and those who did were usually familiar faces from the community or women from the support group. But the car that pulled up was unfamiliar, its sleek black exterior gleaming under the fading light. Sarah watched as the engine cut off and the driver's side door opened. Her breath caught slightly as James stepped out, his shoulders hunched, his eyes tired and worn. He looked older than she remembered, the lines on his face deeper, his posture less certain. He stood there for a moment, as if gathering the courage to approach, his gaze locked on the mansion that had once been his home. Sarah's expression hardened, but she remained where she was, rooted to the spot by a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. He walked slowly, his steps hesitant, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. When he reached the porch, he stopped at the base of the stairs, his eyes lifting to meet hers. "Sarah," he began, his voice rough and weary. She didn't respond, her gaze unyielding as she crossed her arms over her chest. James shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at his feet before looking back up. I just wanted to talk," he continued, his tone softening. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she nodded once, granting him the chance to speak. James took a shaky breath, his eyes flickering with something that resembled regret. "I know I have no right to be here," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I did you wrong, more than wrong. I betrayed you. I broke what we had, and I can't take that back." His gaze dropped again, his hands fidgeting nervously at his sides. Sarah remained silent, her expression unreadable as she watched him struggle with his words. There was a time when his sorrow would have moved her, when his remorse would have stirred something soft and forgiving in her heart. But that time had passed, replaced by a strength that would not be shaken. James cleared his throat, forcing himself to meet her eyes. "I've lost everything," he continued, his voice cracking slightly. "Melissa, she left, took what little I had left and ran. I guess I should have seen it coming, but I didn't." He laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and empty. "I thought I was building something better, but I was just tearing it all down." He paused, waiting for her to respond, but she didn't. Her silence pressed against him, heavy and unyielding, forcing him to fill the space with words. "I'm sorry," he whispered finally, the admission falling between them like a broken promise. "I know it doesn't fix anything, but I am. I'm so sorry, Sarah." Sarah took a slow, measured breath, the air filling her lungs with calm resolve. Her eyes never left his, steady and unyielding as she stepped forward, closing the space between them. "You think you can just come back here and say you're sorry?" she asked, her voice low and even. James's eyes dropped again, but she didn't let him escape. "Look at me," she demanded, her tone sharp. He lifted his gaze, his expression filled with regret. "You took everything from me," she continued, her voice firm. "You threw me out of my own home, humiliated me in front of the world, and paraded that woman around like I never existed." Her hands clenched at her sides, the memory of it all flashing through her mind with vivid clarity. "And now you want me to forgive you because she left you? Because you finally realized what you lost?" James opened his mouth to speak, but she cut him off with a wave of her hand. "No," she said firmly, her eyes blazing with determination. "You don't get to walk back into my life because yours fell apart. I built this. I rebuilt everything you tried to destroy, and I did it without you." Her voice softened, but her gaze remained hard. "I hope you find peace, James, but you won't find it here." He swallowed hard, his shoulders slumping under the weight of her words. For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy and final. Then, without another word, James turned and walked back to his car, his footsteps heavy with the weight of consequences. Sarah watched him go, her heart steady and unyielding, knowing that she had closed the door on that chapter of her life for good. And as the taillights disappeared down the driveway, she turned back to her house, the home she had fought for, the life she had reclaimed, and stepped inside, her spirit stronger than ever.